The telegram that ended 2 Australian lives was sent from London, not Pretoria. That detail matters. When Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant and Lieutenant Peter Hancock stood before a firing squad at dawn on February 27, 1902, the decision had already been written in Whitehall offices weeks before any evidence was heard. The trial that preceded their execution was not designed to establish guilt or innocence. It was designed to produce a specific outcome that would satisfy political requirements thousands of miles away from the African veldt where these men had fought. The court-martial records reveal something more disturbing than judicial error. They reveal institutional murder dressed in legal ceremony, a deliberate sacrifice of colonial soldiers to protect imperial reputation. What makes this story significant is not that 2 men faced firing squads during wartime. Executions happened. What makes this significant is that the British Empire created a system where soldiers could be ordered to commit acts in whispered conversations, then prosecuted for those same acts when political winds shifted. The orders were never written. The commanders who gave them were never questioned. The only men who paid were Australians whose loyalty to empire had been absolute right up until the moment that loyalty became inconvenient to London. This is a story about power and expendability, about who gives orders and who bears consequences, about an empire's willingness to destroy its own soldiers to maintain diplomatic fiction. It is also a story about how Australia began to understand that loyalty flowed in only one direction, and that understanding would shape the nation's relationship with Britain for the next century. The executions created a wound in Australian consciousness that never properly healed. Every legal petition filed over the following 100 years, every historical re-examination, every play and film and poem kept returning to the same fundamental questions. Were these men scapegoats? Were they following orders? Did they receive anything resembling justice? The answers matter because they define whether a nation can trust the institutions that command its soldiers. The Boer War was where Australians first fought as Australians under a unified national identity. Federation had occurred just 1 year before Morant and Hancock deployed. They went to South Africa believing they represented something new, something vigorous and capable that would prove colonial worth to the mother country. What they discovered instead was that colonial lives were currency to be spent when convenient and discarded when problematic. The British command structure viewed Australian irregular cavalry as useful for dirty work, precisely because they were expendable. When that work became diplomatically inconvenient, the same command structure fed them to tribunals with predetermined outcomes. The firing squad that morning in Pretoria was not justice. It was policy. Understanding why requires understanding the war these men fought, the orders they followed, and the political calculations that made their deaths necessary to men who never came within 1,000 miles of combat. The Second Boer War began in October 1899 as a conventional conflict the British expected to win within months. The Boers were farmers, after all, descendants of Dutch settlers who had established republics in the Transvaal and Orange Free State. They lacked professional armies, industrial capacity, or international allies. British strategic planning assumed overwhelming force would produce rapid submission. Those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. The Boers understood their terrain. They were horsemen and marksmen who had grown up in the saddle with rifles in hand. They fought mobile warfare that exploited the vast distances of the South African interior, attacking supply lines and isolated garrisons, then disappearing into countryside they knew intimately. British formations trained for European battlefield confrontation found themselves fighting an enemy who refused to mass for decisive engagement. Conventional tactics failed repeatedly. British casualties mounted while strategic objectives remained unmet. By 1900, the war had shifted into something the Empire had not anticipated and did not know how to fight. The Boer Republic's conventional forces had been defeated, their capitals occupied. But the war did not end. Instead, it metastasized into guerrilla resistance that would continue for 2 more years and cost the British Empire its international reputation. Lord Kitchener assumed command of British forces in November 1900, with instructions to end the conflict by any means necessary. His solution was systematic devastation. Boer farms were burned, livestock was slaughtered or confiscated. Women and children were relocated to concentration camps, where disease and malnutrition would eventually claim 26,000 lives. The strategy was designed to eliminate the support infrastructure that sustained guerrilla operations. If Boer commandos could not resupply from sympathetic farms, could not rely on civilian intelligence networks, could not disappear into friendly countryside, then their capacity to continue resistance would collapse. The policy worked in strategic terms. It also created international outrage that threatened British diplomatic standing across Europe. Liberal opposition in Parliament denounced the concentration camps as barbaric. International observers documented conditions that shocked even war-hardened correspondents. The British government faced a crisis of legitimacy that required careful management. The Empire needed to win the war, but also needed to appear to be fighting that war according to civilized rules of engagement. This contradiction created impossible pressures on commanders in the field who understood that victory required methods that could never be publicly acknowledged. The situation in the northern Transvaal, where Morant and Hancock operated, was particularly difficult. This was remote territory, where small Boer commandos moved constantly, attacking isolated British positions, then vanishing into the bush. The Bushveld Carbineers had been formed specifically to counter this threat. They were an irregular unit, composed primarily of Australian and South African colonials, horsemen who could match the Boers' mobility and endurance. They operated independently, often beyond direct supervision, conducting patrols and responding to intelligence about commando movements. Their effectiveness depended on moving fast and making decisions without waiting for permission from distant headquarters. This operational independence created an environment where orders could be communicated informally, where written documentation might not exist for actions that commanders preferred to maintain deniability about. The Carbineers understood they were expected to be aggressive, to pursue contacts, to eliminate threats. What constituted acceptable methods was never precisely defined. That ambiguity was not accidental. It allowed British command to benefit from harsh tactics while maintaining distance from those same tactics if political circumstances required disavowal. Captain Alfred Taylor commanded the Bushveld Carbineers detachment where Morant served as a lieutenant. Taylor was a British officer, a professional soldier who understood imperial politics and the importance of written orders versus whispered guidance. He knew what Kitchener's scorched earth policy meant in practice. He knew that Boer prisoners represented logistical problems in remote areas where escort details reduced operational capability. He knew that the practice of releasing captured guerrillas on parole had proven useless because those same fighters returned to combat. He understood the unspoken logic that suggested prisoners who could not be properly processed might be dealt with more permanently. Whether Taylor explicitly ordered summary executions or simply created an environment where subordinates understood such actions would be acceptable remains disputed. What the records show clearly is that he never provided written guidance prohibiting such actions, never investigated incidents when they occurred, and never sought clarification from higher command about proper procedures for handling captured combatants in situations where standard protocols could not be followed. His silence functioned as permission. His distance from specific incidents provided deniability. This was leadership designed to insulate commanders from consequences while allowing necessary but politically dangerous actions to proceed. Harry Morant arrived in South Africa as a volunteer whose motivations mixed adventure, patriotic duty, and escape from personal troubles in Australia. He was 35 years old, a man whose life had been lived on the edges of respectability and convention. He broke horses, wrote poetry, drank heavily, and possessed a charisma that made him simultaneously popular and unreliable. His verse appeared in the Bulletin under the pen name Breaker Morant, celebrating bush life and Australian identity with skill that suggested genuine literary talent mixed with calculated performance. He understood how to present himself, how to tell stories that enhanced his legend. He was not a professional soldier. His military experience consisted of militia service and the kind of riding and shooting skills that colonial life developed naturally. What he brought to the Bushveld Carbineers was courage, horsemanship, and a willingness to take orders from men he considered his betters. His loyalty to British command was absolute. He believed in empire, in the civilizing mission, in the rightness of the cause he served. That loyalty would be his undoing because it prevented him from recognizing that his superiors viewed him as expendable. Peter Hancock was a different man entirely. Where Morant performed, Hancock worked. He was a blacksmith from New South Wales, a skilled tradesman who understood metal and horses and hard physical labor. He was quiet, competent, and utterly reliable. Fellow soldiers described him as a dead shot and a steady hand in difficult situations. He did not write poetry or cultivate mystique. He simply did what was required with a craftsman's attention to detail and quality. His relationship with Morant was professional rather than close. They were not drinking companions or particular friends. They were officers in the same unit who respected each other's capabilities and worked together when operations required it. Hancock's involvement in the events that would lead to his execution flowed from following orders he believed came from legitimate authority. He was not a man who questioned command decisions or sought to understand political implications. He was a soldier who did his duty as he understood it. That understanding was based on what his superiors communicated through word and example about what was expected and what was acceptable. When those communications proved to be traps set by men protecting their own interests, Hancock had neither the political sophistication nor the social position to recognize the danger until it was far too late. The catalyst for everything that followed was the death of Captain Hunt. He commanded another Bushveld Carbineers detachment and was well liked by the men. In August 1901, his patrol was ambushed by Boer forces. Hunt was captured wounded. What happened next remains disputed, but when his body was recovered, the evidence suggested he had been executed while wounded rather than taken prisoner for treatment. The exact circumstances were never definitively established, but the soldiers who found him believed he had been murdered in cold blood. The impact on the Carbineers was immediate and visceral. Hunt's death transformed the conflict from a professional military operation into something personal. The men wanted revenge. They wanted to make the Boers pay in ways that official military justice could never deliver. Morant in particular was affected. He and Hunt had been friends. He wrote letters describing his determination to exact retribution for what he viewed as a war crime. The language he used was not measured or strategic. It was angry and absolute. He was going to make the Boers understand that killing a British officer had consequences. Whether this determination led him to exceed his authority or simply to execute orders that had always existed in unspoken form remains the central question. What is clear is that in the weeks following Hunt's death, several Boer prisoners in Morant's custody did not survive to reach formal detention. The first incident occurred on August 11, 1901. A Boer commando leader named Visser was captured during a patrol. Under standard procedure, he should have been transported to Petersburg for formal processing as a prisoner of war. Instead, he was shot while allegedly attempting to escape. The official report stated he tried to flee and was killed in the act. No one questioned this explanation at the time. Escape attempts by prisoners were common enough, and standing orders authorized use of lethal force to prevent them. What made this incident significant in retrospect was the pattern it established. Over the following weeks, multiple prisoners captured by Morant's patrols died in similar circumstances. Some were shot while allegedly escaping. Others simply disappeared from custody with minimal documentation about their fate. The accumulation of incidents began to attract attention from officers who wondered whether escape attempts were genuinely occurring or whether something else was happening. When missionaries and Boer civilians began reporting that captured family members never arrived at official detention facilities, the questions became more pointed. Someone was eliminating prisoners systematically. Whether this represented unauthorized action by Morant or implementation of unwritten policy from higher command became a question that would determine whether the British Empire admitted its complicity or sacrificed subordinates to maintain deniability. The incident that would ultimately prove most damaging involved a German missionary named Hees. He had witnessed the execution of several Boer prisoners by carbineers under Morant's command and was traveling to Petersburg to report what he had seen. On August 23, 1901, Hees's wagon was found beside the road. He was missing. His body was never recovered, but the circumstantial evidence strongly suggested he had been killed to prevent his testimony from reaching authorities. This was not combat action against enemy fighters. This was the murder of a civilian witness to prevent exposure of other crimes. The killing of Hees crossed a line that even the most permissive interpretation of irregular warfare could not justify. It was evidence of consciousness of guilt, proof that the men involved understood they had done things that could not survive scrutiny. When word of Hees's disappearance reached British command, the political calculus changed immediately. Summary execution of Boer combatants might be tolerated or ignored under the theory that guerrilla warfare created impossible situations requiring harsh solutions. But the murder of a German national, who was a civilian protected person under international law, created diplomatic complications that could not be managed through silence. Germany was watching the Boer War closely. International opinion was already critical of British conduct. If evidence emerged that British colonial troops were murdering neutral civilians to cover war crimes, the diplomatic consequences would be severe. The British command faced a choice. They could investigate properly, follow the chain of responsibility upward, determine whether subordinate officers had been following implicit guidance from superiors about how to handle prisoners. Or they could isolate the problem, blame specific individuals, and demonstrate to international observers that the Empire took violations seriously by punishing those responsible. The decision was made quickly. Morant and Hancock would be court-martialed, along with several other Carbineers officers. The charges would focus on specific incidents that could be proven. The trial would demonstrate British commitment to military justice and civilized warfare. The fact that these men might have been following orders would not be examined too carefully, because doing so would implicate senior commanders whose reputations and careers needed protection. The legal proceedings would create a narrative where rogue colonial officers exceeded their authority and committed crimes that contradicted British policy and values. This narrative was politically necessary. It was also fundamentally dishonest. The orders that Morant and Hancock followed existed. They simply existed in the form of unwritten guidance, verbal communications, and the kind of knowing silence that allowed actions to proceed while maintaining deniability for those who commanded. The court-martial convened in January 1902 in Petersburg. The proceedings were closed to press and public, conducted behind walls that ensured the Empire could control what emerged and what remained hidden. Morant and Hancock were charged with multiple murders of Boer prisoners. The prosecution presented evidence that prisoners had been shot without trial, that standing orders requiring proper processing had been violated, that these were criminal acts rather than legitimate combat operations. The defense faced immediate obstacles that revealed the trial's true purpose. They were denied access to witnesses who could testify about command guidance. They were not permitted to call senior officers who might confirm that summary execution of guerrillas was accepted practice in the northern Transvaal. They were given minimal time to prepare and no opportunity to investigate the chain of command that had authorized or encouraged the actions being prosecuted. The court consisted entirely of British officers who understood their professional futures depended on producing the outcome that London required. This was not a search for truth. It was theatre designed to produce a predetermined conclusion that served political requirements. Major Thomas testified for the defence. He had served in the Bushveld Carbineers and understood the operational environment where Morant and Hancock had been working. His testimony described the reality of guerrilla warfare in the northern Transvaal, the impossibility of following standard procedures for prisoner handling when operating in remote territory with small detachments. The communications from higher command that suggested aggressive action against captured combatants was expected. He explained that the practice of taking no prisoners was widespread, that it was understood to be policy even if never formally articulated, that these men had been doing what they believed their commanders wanted. His testimony was noted and ignored. The court was not interested in establishing whether broader command responsibility existed. It was interested in establishing individual guilt that could be punished to satisfy diplomatic requirements. When Major Thomas finished testifying, the court moved on without exploring the implications of what he had described. The institutional silence was absolute. No one asked whether Kitchener knew. No one questioned whether Taylor had provided guidance. No one examined whether the accused had reasonably believed they were following orders. The trial proceeded as though these men had acted entirely on their own initiative, motivated by personal criminality rather than institutional pressure. Morant defended himself with skill that surprised observers who expected a rough colonial horseman to be inarticulate under pressure. He was eloquent and angry. He argued that he had followed the customs of warfare in the region, that he had acted consistent with what he understood to be acceptable practice, that his superiors had never corrected him when they learned of his actions. He pointed out that no written orders existed prohibiting what he had done, that verbal guidance had suggested such actions were expected, that he was being prosecuted for doing what the Empire needed done but could not publicly acknowledge. His argument was legally sound and politically impossible to accept. The court could not admit that unwritten orders existed because doing so would implicate the command structure. It could not acknowledge that summary execution was policy because doing so would confirm international accusations about British conduct of the war. Morant's defense required the Empire to admit truths that were politically unacceptable. His eloquence, therefore, worked against him. He demonstrated that he understood exactly what he had done and why, which made him more dangerous rather than less. A man who could articulate institutional complicity was a man who needed to be silenced. Hancock's defense was simpler and more desperate. He was following orders. He was a subordinate officer who did what his superiors commanded. He had no authority to question or refuse. His defense counsel argued that military discipline required obedience, that Hancock could not be held criminally responsible for actions taken pursuant to orders from legitimate authority. This defense had legal merit within military law. It also had political problems. If Hancock was acquitted on grounds that he followed orders, then responsibility shifted to whoever gave those orders. That inquiry could not be permitted to proceed. The court therefore rejected the defense of superior orders with minimal discussion. Hancock was responsible for his actions, regardless of what he was told to do. This conclusion established that soldiers could be held individually accountable for implementing policy, but the officers who created that policy would face no scrutiny. The precedent was clear. Obedience protected superiors, but not subordinates. The chain of command flowed in only one direction when consequences needed to be assigned. The verdict was delivered on February 26, 1902. Morant and Hancock were found guilty on multiple charges of murder. The sentence was death by firing squad. Other Carbineers officers tried alongside them received lesser sentences. The selectivity was revealing. The men who actually pulled triggers received prison terms. The officers who commanded received execution. This was not about punishing the most culpable. It was about creating an example that would satisfy diplomatic requirements while eliminating men who knew too much about how the empire actually fought its wars. The sentence was subject to confirmation by higher authority. Military law required that Lord Kitchener personally review and approve any death sentence before execution could proceed. This was the moment when mercy might have intervened, when someone with actual power could have examined the circumstances and recognized that these men were scapegoats. Kitchener confirmed the sentences immediately. He added his own commentary that the executions should proceed without delay because any hesitation might encourage further indiscipline. His language revealed what he actually thought these men were being punished for. It was not murder. It was being caught. The executions were scheduled for dawn the following morning. There would be no appeal, no review by civilian authority, no opportunity for the Australian government to intervene on behalf of its citizens. The speed was deliberate. Every hour's delay created opportunity for political complications. Questions might be asked in Parliament. The press might obtain details. The Australian public might learn that their soldiers were being shot by British firing squads for crimes that might have been committed under orders from British officers. The risk of exposure increased with every passing hour. The solution was to complete the executions before anyone could interfere. The efficiency was impressive in its brutality. From verdict to firing squad in less than 12 hours. The Empire knew how to dispose of inconvenient witnesses when political necessity required it. Morant spent his final night writing letters and poetry. He understood what was happening and why. His final verses included lines that would become famous in Australia. They were defiant rather than apologetic, angry rather than resigned. He wrote about taking orders from men who were now abandoning him, about dying for an empire that cared nothing for colonial lives, about the injustice of being punished for doing what he had been told to do. His words were not those of a man who believed he was a criminal. They were the words of a man who understood he was being sacrificed to protect reputations that mattered more than his life. Whether he was right about the orders remains debated. What is not debated is that he believed it absolutely. His final night was not spent in repentance. It was spent in rage at the men who had used him and were now discarding him. Hancock was quieter. He wrote to his family. He maintained dignity that impressed even the guards who watched him. He did not rage or weep or beg. He simply waited for morning with the same steady competence he had brought to every other task in his life. He understood that nothing he said would change the outcome. The decisions had been made by men he would never meet in rooms he would never enter for reasons that had nothing to do with justice. His silence was not acceptance. It was the recognition that protest was useless against power that had already decided he needed to die. What he thought during those final hours remains unknown. He left no dramatic statements or eloquent verse. He simply endured the last night of his life with the same quiet strength that had defined his character. When morning came, he walked to the wall without hesitation. The firing squad assembled in the pre-dawn darkness at Pretoria Prison. The men selected for this duty were British regulars, professionals who could be trusted to follow orders without hesitation or subsequent gossip. They formed up in the prison courtyard, where a wall provided backdrop that would stop bullets and prevent ricochets. The morning was cold. The light was gray. Everything happened efficiently because delay would have been cruelty to everyone involved. Morant and Hancock were brought out separately. Military protocol required that condemned men be offered blindfolds. Both refused. They wanted to see the men who were killing them. They were positioned against the wall. The firing squad raised rifles on command. The officer in charge raised his sword. The moment between the sword falling and the rifles firing lasted forever and not long enough. The sound echoed off the prison walls and vanished into the African morning. When the smoke cleared, 2 Australian officers were dead. The Empire had protected its secrets. The orders that were never written had been permanently obscured. The men who gave those orders continued their careers without interruption. Lord Kitchener received no criticism. Captain Taylor faced no investigation. The chain of command that stretched from Whitehall to the northern Transvaal remained intact and unexposed. The bodies were buried quickly in unmarked graves. There would be no ceremony, no public acknowledgement, no opportunity for these deaths to become politically symbolic. The British command wanted the matter closed immediately. Official records were sealed. The court-martial transcripts were classified. The men who had testified were warned not to discuss what they had seen or heard. The institutional machinery of silence moved efficiently to ensure that the full story would not emerge to complicate diplomatic relations or raise questions about command responsibility. What the British did not anticipate was that silence would prove impossible to maintain once word reached Australia. The executions created outrage that transcended political divisions. Conservatives who supported the Empire and progressives who opposed it found common cause in demanding answers about how Australian soldiers could be court-martialed in secret and shot without their own government being informed or consulted. The anger was not primarily about guilt or innocence. It was about process and power, about who had authority over Australian lives and whose interests were being protected. The Australian government filed formal protests demanding full disclosure of the court-martial records. The British response was bureaucratic obstruction disguised as cooperation. Some documents were provided, others were withheld on grounds of military security or diplomatic sensitivity. The material released was carefully curated to support the narrative that Morant and Hancock had been legitimate criminals whose convictions resulted from proper legal process. Evidence that might suggest they were following orders was excluded. Testimony describing the broader command environment was redacted. The Australian government lacked the power to compel fuller disclosure. It could protest, but not investigate independently. The imbalance of power between colony and empire was absolute. Britain controlled the narrative because Britain controlled the records. What emerged publicly was the story Britain wanted told. What remained hidden was the story that would have implicated British command in the very actions for which these men had been executed. The legal petitions began within months of the executions and continued for the next century. Morant's family sought posthumous pardon. Military historians filed briefs arguing that the court-martial had been fundamentally flawed. The arguments evolved as more documents were declassified and more witnesses came forward. What remained consistent was the central claim that these men had been scapegoats for policy, that they had followed orders they believed legitimate, that the trial had been designed to protect British command rather than determine actual guilt. The British government rejected every petition. The official position never wavered. Morant and Hancock were criminals who received fair trials and appropriate sentences. The executions were just. No pardon was warranted. This consistency suggested either absolute confidence in the original verdict or absolute determination to avoid admitting that the Empire had murdered its own soldiers to protect diplomatic convenience. The distinction matters because one reflects judicial confidence and the other reflects institutional corruption. The evidence increasingly pointed toward the second explanation. The Australian public never forgot. The story entered national mythology as an example of British willingness to sacrifice colonial lives to protect imperial interests. It became a reference point in debates about Australian independence and whether the nation should continue to defer to British authority in military and foreign policy matters. When Australia committed troops to subsequent conflicts, the phrase, "Will they shoot us when we become inconvenient?" appeared in opposition rhetoric and soldier correspondence. The wound was deep and permanent. It shaped Australian skepticism toward authority, resistance to orders that lacked clear written documentation, and insistence on transparent legal processes for military justice. The cultural impact was broader than military policy. It reinforced the Australian identity characteristic of distrust toward established power and loyalty to mates over institutions. The phrase, "Shoot straight, you coward," became shorthand for resistance to unjust authority. It appeared in political cartoons, protest movements, and popular culture references that kept the story alive across generations who had never heard of the Bushveld Carbineers but understood instinctively what the story meant. The declassification of British military records in the late 20th century provided new evidence that supported claims the trial had been fundamentally compromised. Documents showed that Kitchener had been informed of summary execution practices in the northern Transvaal before the court-martial, that he had not ordered those practices to stop, that his concern had been diplomatic exposure rather than military misconduct. Communications between London and Pretoria revealed that the decision to prosecute had been driven by German diplomatic pressure following Heese's death, rather than by genuine commitment to military justice. Most significantly, records showed that other officers in other units had engaged in similar conduct without facing any charges. The selectivity of prosecution suggested that Morant and Hancock were chosen not because they were the most culpable, but because they were the most expendable. British officers who had implemented the same policies escaped scrutiny. Colonial officers became scapegoats. The pattern was clear and damning. The question of whether Morant and Hancock actually committed the acts they were charged with is less interesting than the question of whether those acts constituted crimes within the context they occurred. No one seriously disputes that prisoners were shot. The evidence for that is overwhelming.
What remains disputed is whether those shootings represented unauthorized criminality or implementation of policy that had been communicated through the informal channels that characterize irregular warfare. The distinction matters legally and morally. If these men exceeded their authority and killed prisoners contrary to orders, then their prosecution and execution was just.
If they followed guidance from superiors who subsequently disavowed that guidance to protect themselves, then the executions were institutional murder. The evidence increasingly supports the second interpretation. Too many witnesses described the command environment as one where taking prisoners was discouraged. Too many similar incidents in other units went unpunished. Too many senior officers escaped investigation, while subordinates faced firing squads. The pattern suggests systematic policy rather than isolated criminality. The legacy of these executions extends beyond Australian military history into questions about command responsibility and the limits of obedience. Modern military justice recognizes that soldiers can be ordered to commit crimes and that following such orders does not eliminate individual responsibility. The principle established at Nuremberg was that illegal orders provide no defense. But the Morant and Hancock case occurred before that principle was established, in an environment where military culture emphasized absolute obedience to superior authority. Were these men morally culpable for following orders they believed legitimate? Should they have refused and faced court-martial for insubordination? Could they have reasonably understood that the guidance they were receiving contradicted written policy when that policy was never clearly communicated to them? These questions remain unresolved because they involve competing values that cannot be easily reconciled. Military effectiveness requires trust in the chain of command. Military morality requires individual responsibility. When those requirements conflict, soldiers face impossible choices. The men who shot them that morning had made one choice. Morant and Hancock had made another. The bodies remained in unmarked graves in Pretoria for decades. Multiple efforts to locate and repatriate them failed because the British had not maintained records of exactly where they were buried. Whether this was deliberate erasure or simple bureaucratic indifference remains unknown. What is clear is that the Empire wanted no martyrs' graves, no physical locations where remembrance could focus and grow into political problem. The anonymity was strategic. It prevented the creation of shrines that might sustain anger across generations. But the effort failed because memory did not require physical remains. The story itself became the memorial, retold and re-examined, adapted into plays and films and songs that kept asking the same questions. Why were these men shot? Who gave the orders they followed? Why were superiors never held accountable? The absence of graves meant the questions could never be laid to rest alongside the bodies. They remained alive and insistent, demanding answers that were never adequate. 100 years after the executions, the Australian government formally requested that Britain issue posthumous pardons, recognizing that the court-martial had been fundamentally flawed. The British government declined. The official response stated that the convictions had been properly obtained under the military law of the time, and that modern perspectives could not retroactively invalidate legal proceedings that had met contemporary standards. This response was technically accurate and morally bankrupt. It acknowledged that standards had changed, while refusing to recognize that the original proceedings might have been unjust, even by the standards that existed when they occurred. The refusal to grant pardons was not based on confidence in the verdicts. It was based on unwillingness to admit that the British Empire had executed soldiers to protect institutional secrets. That admission would raise too many questions about how many other inconvenient soldiers had been disposed of, how many other orders had been whispered and then denied, how many other careers had been protected by sacrificing subordinates. The British position was consistent. Silence was safer than honesty. The Australian response was equally revealing. The government accepted the British refusal without significant protest. By the early 21st century, the relationship between the two nations had evolved past the point where Australian identity required confrontation with Britain over historical injustices. The campaign for pardons had been maintained more out of respect for historical memory than expectation of success. What mattered was that Australia had asked the questions and documented the evidence. Whether Britain acknowledged that evidence was less important than ensuring that Australians understood their own history. The story had become part of national identity, a narrative about colonial expendability and the cost of unquestioning loyalty to distant power. It taught lessons about demanding accountability, questioning authority, and protecting soldiers from being used for purposes they do not understand. Those lessons had value regardless of whether Britain ever admitted the truth about what had happened in Pretoria that February morning. The cultural resonance of the Morant and Hancock executions appears in unexpected places. References appear in political speeches about Australian sovereignty. The story is taught in military academies as a case study in command responsibility and the dangers of unwritten orders. It influences contemporary debates about Australian military commitments to Allied operations in distant conflicts. When politicians propose sending Australian forces to support British or American operations, the question inevitably arises about whether those forces will be protected or abandoned if political circumstances change. The historical memory creates skepticism that serves as a check on blind alliance commitment. This skepticism is healthy. It recognizes that national interests sometimes diverge, that promises made during one political climate may not be honored when that climate shifts, that soldiers sent to fight for Allied causes may find themselves expendable when maintaining alliance becomes more costly than valuable. The lesson is not that alliances should be avoided. The lesson is that alliance commitments must be clear, documented, and subject to national rather than imperial authority. The legal argument that these men were following orders raises difficult questions about what orders can legitimately be followed and when soldiers have obligation to refuse. Modern military law is clear that illegal orders provide no defense, but the determination of what constitutes an illegal order requires soldiers to have clear understanding of legal parameters and confidence that refusing orders will not result in their own prosecution or professional destruction. The environment in the Northern Transvaal provided neither clarity nor confidence. Standing written orders said one thing, Verbal guidance from superiors suggested another. The operational reality suggested a third. Soldiers caught in that contradiction had to make choices based on incomplete information and competing authorities. They chose to follow the guidance of immediate superiors who they believed represented institutional authority. That choice proved fatal when the institution decided it needed scapegoats. Whether a different choice was realistically available remains questionable. Refusing orders in a combat zone carries consequences that can include courts-martial, imprisonment, and execution for cowardice or mutiny. The men who faced firing squads for following orders might have faced firing squads for refusing them. The trap was complete. The broader pattern of colonial soldiers being used for work that required deniability extended far beyond this single incident. Throughout the empire's history, colonial troops were employed for suppression operations, counterinsurgency campaigns, and irregular warfare where methods could not survive scrutiny under international law. The British officer corps understood that colonial soldiers could be sacrificed if operations became politically problematic in ways that British soldiers could not. This was not explicitly stated policy. It was understood practice that operated through informal networks and unspoken assumptions. Colonial lives were currency that could be spent to protect British interests and British reputations. The Morant and Hancock executions were exceptional only in that they became public knowledge and symbolic reference points. How many similar disposals occurred without documentation or protest remains unknown. The absence of evidence does not indicate the absence of pattern. It indicates the effectiveness of institutional silence. The relationship between Australia and Britain never fully recovered from the wound these executions created. Federation in 1901 had occurred with the assumption that Australia would remain a loyal dominion within the empire, contributing troops and resources to imperial defence while accepting British leadership in foreign policy and military strategy. The executions demonstrated that loyalty flowed in only one direction, and that Australian lives would be sacrificed to British convenience without consultation or apology. This recognition accelerated Australian movement toward independent foreign policy and military command structures. When the First World War began, Australian forces served under Australian command despite British pressure to integrate them directly into British formations. The insistence on separate command reflected determination that Australian soldiers would not be placed in positions where they could be used and discarded without accountability to Australian authority. The Gallipoli campaign would create new wounds and new questions about British strategic competence, but the command structure ensured that responsibility for Australian casualties was shared rather than deflected entirely onto convenient scapegoats. The mythology that grew around Morant himself is complex and sometimes problematic. He has been portrayed as a romantic figure, a larrikin hero, who defied authority and paid the ultimate price. This romanticization obscures the reality that he was involved in killing prisoners and possibly a civilian witness. The executions were unjust, not because he was innocent, but because he was selectively prosecuted for acts that were policy rather than aberration. The distinction matters. Morant can be recognized as a scapegoat without being transformed into a hero. His poetry has literary merit. His courage in facing death was genuine. His articulate defense of his actions demonstrated intelligence and principle. None of this changes the fact that prisoners under his authority were shot rather than processed according to law. The moral complexity is important to preserve. Simplifying the story into a tale of innocent victims murdered by the empire serves mythology rather than history. The actual story is darker and more instructive. It is about how institutions create conditions where good people make terrible choices, then punish those people to avoid examining the conditions that produce those choices. The question of what justice would look like a century after the executions has no satisfactory answer. Posthumous pardons would acknowledge injustice, but cannot restore lives or repair damage. Financial compensation to descendants would be symbolic but inadequate. Full disclosure of remaining classified documents would satisfy historical curiosity, but probably reveal nothing that fundamentally changes existing understanding. The most meaningful form of justice might be institutional acknowledgement that the trial was designed to protect command responsibility rather than determine individual guilt, that these men were sacrificed to diplomatic necessity, and that the empire failed in its obligation to protect soldiers who served it. Such acknowledgement would require Britain to admit that its institutions were capable of deliberate injustice when political convenience required it. That admission remains unlikely because it would undermine narratives about British commitment to rule of law and civilized warfare that are central to national identity and international reputation. The Australian response to this history has been to ensure that the pattern cannot repeat. Modern Australian military law requires written orders for all operations. Verbal guidance that contradicts written policy is explicitly not binding. Soldiers have legal protection for refusing orders they reasonably believe to be unlawful. Command responsibility is emphasized in training and doctrine, making clear that superiors cannot escape accountability by claiming they never explicitly ordered subordinates to commit acts they nonetheless encouraged or permitted. Court-martial procedures include safeguards designed to prevent predetermined outcomes and ensure fair process. These reforms reflect lessons learned from the Morant and Hancock case and similar historical injustices. Whether they would actually prevent a repetition if political pressure became severe enough remains uncertain. The value of legal protections depends on institutional will to enforce them against political convenience. History suggests that will erodes when stakes become high enough. The story endures because it captures something essential about the relationship between individuals and institutions, between soldiers and the states that command them. Every person who serves in military forces makes a bargain. They accept risk and subordinate individual judgment to institutional authority in exchange for the assumption that the institution will protect them, that it will use their lives only for legitimate purposes, and that it will honor its obligations to them. The Morant and Hancock executions revealed that this bargain can be one-sided, that institutions will sacrifice individuals to protect themselves, that loyalty flows upward but not necessarily downward. This revelation is permanently disturbing because it undermines the trust that makes military service possible. Soldiers cannot function if they believe their commanders will abandon them when politically convenient. Yet history demonstrates that such abandonment occurs. The tension between necessary trust and warranted skepticism defines military culture in democracies. The balance is never perfect and always contested. The final legacy is not about guilt or innocence, but about accountability and transparency. Whether Morant and Hancock deserved execution for their actions is less important than whether the process that condemned them was just and whether the men who commanded them faced equivalent scrutiny. The answer to both questions is clearly no. They received a trial designed to produce a specific outcome. Their superiors faced no investigation. This asymmetry reveals institutional corruption that transcends individual cases. It demonstrates that military justice can be perverted to serve political purposes, that legal proceedings can be theater rather than truth-seeking, that power protects itself by sacrificing those who lack power. These lessons remain relevant because the dynamics that produce them remain operative. Institutions still have incentives to protect themselves rather than acknowledge error. Subordinates are still more expendable than superiors. Political convenience still trumps individual justice when stakes are high enough. The specific circumstances of colonial warfare in 1902 are historical. The underlying patterns are permanent. What remains is the question of memory and meaning. Australia remembers these executions as an example of British willingness to sacrifice colonial lives. Britain remembers them as the proper punishment of criminals who exceeded authority. Both narratives serve national purposes. Both omit complexity in favor of clarity. The historical record supports the Australian interpretation more strongly. But even that interpretation requires acknowledgement that the men executed were not simply victims. They made choices under impossible circumstances. They killed prisoners who, under other circumstances, would have been protected persons. They were more than they are sometimes portrayed, and less guilty than the system that used them. The ambiguity is uncomfortable, but necessary. History that reduces complex moral situations to simple narratives of innocence and guilt fails to teach the lessons that matter. The lessons here are about how institutions create pressure, how loyalty can be weaponized, how silence protects the powerful while sacrificing the expendable, and how legal processes can be corrupted to serve predetermined outcomes. Those lessons transcend the specific case and remain relevant wherever power operates without adequate accountability. The executions at Pretoria Prison on February 27, 1902, ended 2 Australian lives, but created a story that would never die. That story asks questions that every generation must answer for itself. What do we owe to soldiers who serve in our name? How do we prevent institutions from using legal processes to obscure their own failures? When do we question orders rather than follow them? How do we balance military effectiveness with moral accountability? The questions have no permanent answers, because circumstances change and competing values cannot be definitively reconciled. What remains constant is the obligation to keep asking, to resist institutional narratives that are too convenient, to demand transparency from power, and to remember that behind every statistic and policy decision are individual human beings whose lives have worth beyond their utility to institutions. Morant and Hancock were not heroes. They were not simple criminals. They were men caught in systems larger than themselves, used for purposes they understood imperfectly, and discarded when their continued existence became problematic to people who never faced consequences for creating the conditions that led to their deaths. That reality, uncomfortable and unresolved, is the legacy that endures and the lesson that remains permanently relevant.